I think it's safe to say that fandoms often struggle to characterize characters 100% accurately. Obviously, this is the case. A character will often be written slightly differently from fic to fic, and when you're writing a character you didn't create, you won't have the unique knowledge and mindset that the creator does. But one common point of criticism I often see for fandom spaces is the recurring way in which certain characters get portrayed in fanon. Female characters being boiled down to motherly figures, or complex, morally gray characters being treated as irredeemable, or characters being reduced to a ship. All of these are examples of common issues in fanon portrayals of characters. But today, I want to discuss a very specific phenomenon in fanon that I find extremely fascinating. A phenomenon that is well documented with a term to describe it that is widely hated in fandom spaces. That being woobification. To understand woobification, we need to first understand the trope of the wooby. The wooby is a trope term for a character who is sympathetic and suffering greatly throughout the story. As a result, it is common for a fandom to really want to protect and comfort this character, who goes through hardship. And so the fandom sort of has a collective desire to give them comfort content. Woobies basically invoke the same emotions of a sad, sopping wet beast born in a cardboard box all alone. While it is possible for wooby characters to not fit this definition, as female woobies do exist, the main image associated with woobies is sad white men. Popular woobies include Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Kylo Ren from the Star Wars sequels, Zuko from Avatar The Last Airbender, Kurt Wagner, aka Nightcrawler from specifically X-Men Evolution, N from Pokemon, Luigi from Super Mario, Angel Dust from Hazbin Hotel, and the Onceler. Yes, he counts. There are also a few subcategories of woobies that are important to bring up. Most famously, the jerk-ass wooby. A jerk-ass wooby is a character who starts out as a jerk but is later revealed to be sympathetic, thus the audience gets emotional when bad things happen to them. In fact, multiple characters I just listed count as jerk-ass woobies. There is also the Iron Wooby, a character who somehow never gives up despite going through so much. Then there is the Stoic Wooby, a character who suffers greatly but keeps it all bottled up inside. Finally, we have Wooby, Destroyer of Worlds, essentially when the hardships and trauma a wooby deals with serves as the backbone of a villain arc, or at the very least a destructive path. Regardless of all the possible alternations, the character needs to suffer. A lot. That is the core of a wooby, a character who deals with so much shit throughout the story that the fans unite over their shared desire to give this character a hug. So what's the problem? This is a common emotion for fans to have over sympathetic characters. It's almost like the writers wanted us to get attached to them. On the surface, there's nothing really wrong here. However, in fandom, the process of woobification is detested. And I understand why. Because woobification goes beyond the trope of the wooby. Woobification is something more. The process of woobification is often associated with the infantilization of adult male characters. You see, when a character has fans who want to protect them, it is not uncommon for fans to take this desire to its extreme. As in, acting like this character is completely innocent and cannot defend themselves at all. And this is especially the case when this character is a man who is heavily associated with a certain ship. This is why many people in fandoms have negative views on the entire trope of the wooby. But I want to discuss why exactly this happens. What trends can we gather from commonly woobified characters? Why is woobification so common? And what can we learn from this phenomenon? Let's begin. I think the best way to analyze the process of woobification and explain why and how it becomes a problem is to look at specific examples and analyze their fanon perceptions. So let's analyze a few characters who have been woobified in their fandoms. Since all of my videos need to include this franchise one way or the other, let's start with a discussion of Sonic the Hedgehog. Specifically, let's talk about Silver the Hedgehog. As a long-lasting character in the franchise, Silver is a strange case. He first appeared in the absolutely despised Sonic 06 as an antagonist turned ally of Sonic. He initially is antagonistic due to being manipulated by the villain Mephiles, who convinced him that Sonic needs to die to save the world, but in reality, this will bring about the end of the world. By the end of the game, he realizes Mephiles is the true enemy and sides with Sonic. Now, this game is pretty well known for being lauded as one of the worst games ever made, and out of all of the original elements that come from this game, for a long time, Silver was the only one to consistently reappear. Characters like Mephiles and Elise have only recently started to appear again, a sign of the shame finally wearing off. But for a long time, Silver was seen as the only factor of the game to survive the industry-wide embarrassment, and even then, there was still some mockery. The infamous "it's no use" line and scene where Shadow kicks Silver were both massive memes in the fandom for quite a while, resulting in Silver being portrayed as kind of pathetic. But regardless, the fact that it did not take long for Silver to appear in more games showed that he was seen differently by Sega and by extension the fandom. However, like many other Sonic characters, Silver has gone through some personality rewrites, most notably in the recent IDW comics. Silver, in the continuity of the IDW comics, is a bit different compared to his game depictions. I think the best way to illustrate this difference is in the earlier issues, particularly the issue where he meets Whisper the Wolf. He is shown to be a lot sillier and socially awkward in a way that I can only describe as cutesy. Now, in all fairness, this is not the case for every issue. In a lot of issues, he actually has a lot of cool moments, and his determination to do the right thing no matter what is still intact. Rather, the cutesy moments come from his more awkward, socially unaware bits. However, I bring this up because the IDW comics are often credited with a shift in how Silver is portrayed in fanon. While Silver is a much more popular character nowadays, he is probably the most woobified of the main cast. He is arguably more woobified than the characters who are meant to be younger than him, like Tails or Charmy. Silver is often depicted as somewhat emotional and kind of wimpy, despite being shown in canon to have a lot of willpower and strength. I imagine Silver's woobification is a strange mixture of his mimetic infamy and his awkward bean comic portrayal, resulting in fans forgetting the fact that he can absolutely kick ass. I mean, this dude comes from an apocalyptic future, which is something that really needs to be discussed more. Though, hopefully the current arc of the IDW comics can provide some evidence of how awesome Silver can be. And of course, I am going to use any excuse to discuss Spooky Month. Of course, the person that made a Candy Bats deep dive that's half an hour long is going to bring up Spooky Month. So, let's talk about Streber some more. Now, some important context for those who don't know, Streber was a background character introduced in the episode Tender Treats. He is attacked by the episode's main villain, Bob Velseb, and is presumed to be dead. Despite him only existing to die, fans got extremely attached to him almost instantly, and once fans discovered the Kevin X Streber Easter egg, there was no turning back. Streber became inescapable in the fandom, especially in the context of shipping art with Kevin, and especially angst art. I mean, it makes sense, getting your arm ripped off and eaten in front of you as you're left bleeding on the floor of your workplace and passion project is pretty traumatizing. So it's not too surprising that fans gravitated towards this character with intentions to explore that traumatic event. And at the height of the Candy Bats craze, people would often assign Kevin to be the comfort in the Hurt Comfort content. However, after a certain point, this fanon depiction of the relationship would morph into angst for the sake of angst that often unintentionally infantilized Streber. What I mean by that is, while the fandom was obsessed with Streber and creating angst for him, very rarely was the angst focused on the actual trauma and how that would affect him moving forward. Streber content prioritized the aesthetic of angst rather than any actual character exploration. This was especially the case when that content featured Candy Bats. Kevin became less of a partner and more of a caretaker for Streber in certain fanon depictions, with the actual nature of their relationship being diminished. A very specific example of this is the way in which some of Streber's character traits are completely ignored for the sake of depicting him as an anxious being. His sass, his confidence, his intelligence, all of that is downplayed in many examples of Candy Bat's angst, even though it arguably can make the angst more enriching. A character desperately wanting to be protected in a scenario where they weren't is good angst, but it doesn't work for everyone, and I don't think it really applies to a character like Streber. To me, the consistent portrayal of Streber needing to be protected is a fandom-wide example of projection that unintentionally downplays his own agency and his trauma. Still will always love Candy Bats, though. Now, while woobification often happens in the context of ships, there are examples of woobification occurring to deny ships. An example of this would be in the Owl House fandom, particularly with the character of Hunter. Hunter, introduced as the Golden Guard, starts the show as the right-hand man of Emperor Bellos, the main villain. Over the course of Season 2, his character is expanded upon, and it did not take long for the fandom to realize he wasn't actually a villain, but rather a deeply traumatized child. Once the episode Hunting Palisman was released, the episode that first showed his true personality and gave us a face reveal, Hunter went from a character that just kind of existed to a fan favorite overnight. And many fans wanted him to be redeemed and saved for very understandable reasons. He is treated like a tool by his quote-unquote uncle, and very heavily implied to be a victim of extreme abuse. And by that, I mean abuse that they cannot actually show on a Disney Channel show. It is absolutely confirmed that he was abused. So, unsurprisingly, with a character who is simultaneously adorable and angsty, he did experience a bit of woobification. In all fairness, I think Hunter's woobification makes a little bit more sense. Unlike a character like Silver, who is purposefully meant to be ambiguously young, Hunter was portrayed with more of a childlike sense of wonder and curiosity despite being the oldest of the main kids. And in all honesty, it does make sense. Intense trauma can make someone act and think in a more childish way compared to their actual age. Coupled with the fact that he was heavily sheltered, I'm not surprised he was portrayed like this in fanon. Maybe this more childlike depiction had a part to play in the fandom's largest and, in my opinion, stupidest shipping discourse, Huntlow. Huntlow is the ship between Hunter and Willow, the main character's best friend. It is the most popular Hunter ship and one of the main ships in the fandom. And many people did not like it. And in my opinion, as someone who never really cared for Huntlow, this discourse was really ridiculous. There was no good reason for the ship to get so much backlash. When the episode Any Sport in a Storm was released, the episode that essentially made the ship sail, I saw many people argue against the ship on the basis of an age gap? Keep in mind, the age gap is between a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old at most. Many people pointed out that the ship was fine and there really wasn't an age gap at all, and in all fairness, this argument died pretty quickly, at least from what I saw. But then, Huntlow haters moved on to a different argument, the one that I saw way more frequently, that being that Hunter shouldn't have a love interest because he's too traumatized for a relationship, and instead he should focus on healing before he gets with anyone. Honestly, there's a lot to unpack with this. For starters, on a less serious note, this perpetuates the idea that shipping inherently equals the belief that the ship needs to be canon, as the characters are in the moment. This is not the case. Shipping is built on hypotheticals. A character struggling with trauma in the current point of the story has little effect on, say, timeskip AUs where the characters have healed. It is also quite the loaded statement because it unintentionally implies mental illness and trauma reduces your ability to have a fulfilling relationship, which... where do I even start with that? Now granted, Hunter was heavily sheltered to the point where it's implied he only left the castle for missions, something that undeniably affected his development and social skills, which I'm going to charitably assume is why certain Huntlow haters didn't want him to have a romantic storyline. And I will agree, not every character needs a romantic arc. I think romance is way too often perceived as a default in stories, and arguably Hunter's platonic and familial bonds with characters like Luce, Gus, Camilla, and Darius are much more important to his story. But at the same time, there is nothing wrong with fanon giving him a romantic plotline as a mere hypothetical. Fanon is our playground, completely separate from what actually happens on screen, and we do not need to downplay a character's emotional intelligence just because we don't like a ship. Not every ship needs to be a moral dilemma. At the same time, I do believe there are other reasons Huntlow specifically was targeted out of all of the Hunter ships, that being the fandom's disdain towards male-female ships, which is something that is unfortunately very common in fandoms that have a predominantly queer audience. But that's a topic for another video. Another example of woobification being used to deny ships would be recently in the Cookie Run fandom. Pure Vanilla Cookie is one of the most important characters to the lore of Cookie Run Kingdom. He is one of the 5 ancient cookies, a pillar of morality and heroism, and also the equivalent of Jesus Christ in the cookie world. He is often shipped with his fellow ancients, most notably White Lily Cookie. This makes sense as the two are paired together the most out of all the ancient cookies, and they are also quite the tragic ship due to White Lily Cookie's entire story and the events of the Dark Flower War. Their ship, known as Pure Lily, was the most popular ship for Pure Vanilla Cookie back in the day, but of course it's not the only ship for him. Pure Vanilla Cookie is also sometimes shipped with Dark Cacao Cookie due to their opposing personalities. Shipping with Hollyberry Cookie and Golden Cheese Cookie does exist, but it is significantly rarer. However, in recent months, a new Pure Vanilla Cookie ship has risen in popularity, that being Shadow Vanilla, the ship between Pure Vanilla Cookie and Shadow Milk Cookie. Shadow Milk Cookie is one of the 5 Beast Cookies, essentially the original holders of the power the Ancients now hold. Shadow Milk Cookie is the parallel to Pure Vanilla Cookie, and the original holder of his Soul Gem. Therefore, these characters have a special connection that only they share. That alone should give you a hint as to why these two are shipped, but that's not all. Certain scenes in the Beast Yeast story seem to imply that Shadow Milk Cookie's motives evolve over the course of the story. While he initially just wants the Soul Gem and doesn't care about Pure Vanilla Cookie at all, he eventually becomes fixated on Pure Vanilla Cookie, with his minions even commenting on how he was actually happy when Pure Vanilla Cookie was, quote-unquote, by his side, and with dialogue like this. Can you really blame people for coming to that conclusion? However, the ship is also widely hated due to it being perceived as toxic. Now, as much as I would love to explain how the ship is actually just an earnest enemies to lovers ship, the fans of the ship enjoy it from a story perspective because not every ship needs to be perfect and fluffy all the time, and how this is a perfect example of fandom's growing inability to handle more complex relationships even as what-if scenarios, I have plans to discuss that in an entirely separate Shadow Vanilla video. No. Right now, I just want to discuss my least favorite part of the Shadow Vanilla backlash, the infantilization of Pure Vanilla Cookie. This is particularly the case on TikTok because... of fucking course it is. But many people have been spreading rumors and misinterpreting story moments for the purposes of infantilizing Pure Vanilla Cookie, including spreading the claim that Pure Vanilla Cookie is minor coded. Fucking where? That dude founded a kingdom and fought in a war. I seriously don't think anything about him is minor coded. And no, dispelling this right now, Shadow Milk Cookie was imprisoned when Pure Vanilla Cookie was a child. He was not actually spying on Pure Vanilla Cookie as a child, he was trying to manipulate Pure Vanilla Cookie's memories. I honestly think this ship backlash is way worse than Huntlo's because the fact that so many people seem to genuinely believe Pure Vanilla Cookie is a minor is baffling. You are allowed to not like a ship, but you do not need to prove that the ship is objectively, indisputably, confirmed problematic, especially in a case where the toxic nature of the ship is very fantastical, allowing shippers to distinguish it from genuinely disturbing relationship dynamics. A particularly interesting umbrella of woobification comes from the Creepypasta fandom. In general, this fandom is quite unique due to being composed of a plethora of stories all categorized under a very loose genre. But the stories that gained the most attention and infamy were the slasher villain killers who would always get morphed into sad anime boys. Jeff the Killer, Eyeless Jack, Laughing Jack, Tiki Toby, the Bloody Painter, Ben from Ben Drowned. I know Ben Drowned is a whole other subcategory of Creepypasta, but he got lumped into this group as well. The one thing all these characters had in common is the fandom focused heavily on how all these boys were so sad and angsty. Whether they were bullied or abused or sacrificed to a cult, they were all depressed emo babies who desperately needed a found family. In general though, Creepypasta operated very differently compared to other fandoms because it wasn't a fandom surrounding a high-budget TV show or a popular game. It was a fandom comprised of hundreds of stories, all told by different people, ranging in quality, with the most consistently enthusiastic fans being very young. On top of that, the most popular characters have like 10 different versions, all written by different people, and considering the fandom was largely made up of edgy tweens and teens who hyper-focused on the killers being bullying victims rather than, you know, killers, It's not too surprising that the fandom happened to have an issue with character depictions. It was a fandom where the canon was held together with, well, not even duct tape, it was held together with scotch tape. So no one really cared about the canon, they just wanted to have fun with these characters. So it makes some sense to me as to why the fanon versions of the characters so heavily resembled something entirely different from the text. Because for many people, that overshadowed, and in some cases, was more important than the text. And while the creepypasta fandom is often stereotyped as a fandom of teenagers who were secretly twisted fucking psychopaths who wanted to date Jeff the Killer, I think there's a more emotional motive behind the creepypasta woobification. I believe that a lot of fan and creepypasta content was a result of the mortifying ordeal of being 13 years old. When you are around middle school age, you tend to have a lot of emotions. You believe you're more mature than you actually are, and thus it's not uncommon for kids that age to experience interest in darker subjects they don't actually comprehend. And kids often cope with bullying in eccentric ways. So I can honestly sympathize with fan and creepypasta stuff. Though in many ways the disparity of canon versus fanon both benefited and hindered this specific fandom. On the one hand, this creative liberty allowed for a unique freedom in fan-made projects that many fandoms can't replicate. On the other hand, a lot of that freedom was utilized in making serial killer yaoi. In recent years, however, the fandom has definitely shifted, and now I would say there's a pretty good balance of actual horror content and the serial killer yaoi. Though, I can't even entirely hate the fan and creepypasta stuff because Fan and Jeff the Killer is so much more interesting to me. Not in a genuinely scary or well-written way. I just kind of love him. It's just so funny to me. I love Jeff the Killer. I just hope he doesn't Jeff the Kill me. But of course, I could not make a video about woobification without discussing the ultimate victim of it. The one, the only, the legend, the great Papyrus. Yes, it is only fair we discuss Papyrus from Undertale, and how he was treated in the early days of the Undertale fandom. And I should specify, we are specifically discussing the 2015 to 2016 Undertale fandom here, because this is significantly less of an issue nowadays. However, as someone who has been a fan of this character since Undertale was released, hoo boy! Papyrus was honestly cursed in terms of how badly he got woobified. He is canonically a very socially awkward and childish character. He is at the core of one of the game's saddest moments. There are multiple characters who are very overprotective of him. He was frequently shipped with a much more flirty character, and 9 times out of 10 his brother was depicted as disapproving of the ship. And worst of all, the fandom was formed when phrases like small bean and cinnamon roll were still used unironically. My king was truly in hell. In fact, the infantilization got so bad, the fandom has a holiday entirely dedicated to dismissing the idea that Papyrus isn't allowed to swear. June 16th was dubbed Let Papyrus Say Fuck Day, a holiday that is still going strong in the Undertale fandom. This should really speak to how bad this issue was in the early days of the fandom. It should be noted that Papyrus falls into a character fandom trope that significantly increases their chances of being woobified, being a sunshine character. Our society tends to portray happiness and optimism as naive and childish, which often leaks into how fandoms portray these types of characters. Papyrus is undeniably a positive character. He's goofy, naive, and impulsive, but ultimately a kind and hopeful person. His positive personality is shown to have a massive impact on Sans and Undyne, and there is a reason so many fans confess to aborting the genocide route because of him. And I must admit, as someone whose favorite Undertale character is Papyrus, I can confirm his unflinching kindness is one of the reasons he is so beloved. But it is also one of the reasons he is so infantilized. Thankfully, the fandom is much more conscious of this characterization, and thus the fandom is better at avoiding it nowadays. But the early days of Papyrus characterization has definitely left a mark. So why does this happen so frequently? Well, I have a few theories. In my last video, I mentioned how woobification is often a subconscious thing, It's not as if these people are actively going out of their way to treat these adult characters as children, knowingly downplaying their capabilities. No, I truly believe this is just an accidental side effect of fandom wanting to protect these very traumatized characters. Often this falls into two categories. Either this character is the hurt character in hurt comfort content, and thus needs to be more emotionally vulnerable, or the fan is projecting their desires onto a character they want to protect. But there is a more unsavory nature to unconscious woobification. And that is the unfortunate fact that woobification is significantly more common if that character is Asian, queer, specifically a gay man, or neurodivergent. This is also the case if that character is coded, implied, or headcanon to be those things. This is correlated to a variety of harmful stereotypes, as these groups tend to be infantilized in media already. And I want to make something very, very clear. I am not accusing anyone who woobifies a character in fandom to be racist, homophobic, or ableist. I am instead pointing out that these stereotypes and perceptions are so prolific in our culture that many accidentally perpetuate them without realizing it, and so it is important to point them out. Now, while these examples of woobified characters are all vastly different, there is a common trend that correlates to each example I discussed. And that is the fact that fandom has a tendency to specifically treat male characters this way. But when it comes to female characters, they are consistently less likely to get the same adoration. It is commonly discussed in fandoms that female characters are treated much differently compared to male characters, and when it comes to which characters are woobified, this is very much the case. For every fandom that I mentioned, there is a female character who either gets a lot of hate despite being heavily traumatized, or their trauma is rarely explored by the fandom despite it being just as obvious. Very rarely a female character's trauma is discussed in the fandom, but a female character being treated with the same depth and complexity as a male character is genuinely an exception in fandom spaces. This is more likely if the female character is the protagonist or if the ratio of female-male characters is predominantly female. However, a majority of the time, female characters do not get the same level of attention. For every fandom I discussed, you can find a female character who is either widely hated for their actions, no matter how nuanced her story may be, or is excruciatingly simplified and watered down to the point where her trauma is hardly brought up. Occasionally, you will find a sweet spot where a female character is actually appreciated alongside her male counterparts, but even then, it's unlikely she would have the whole fandom rallying to protect her. And I do have a bit of a conspiracy I feel is worth sharing. Going back to the original wooby tropes, while many female characters tend to be earnest jerk-ass woobies, it is extremely common for fans to take jerkish male characters and just portray them as jerk-ass woobies. Fandoms have always been obsessed with bad boys and swearing up and down that there's something good inside, and so it's not uncommon for fandom to invent sympathetic stories for characters who aren't actually sympathetic. Absolutely the best example of this is Jax from The Amazing Digital Circus. Jax is a jerk through and through, and in the early days of the fandom, he was often portrayed as having a secret soft side or a tragic backstory. In recent months, this has become less and less common as fans realized he was just straight up a jerk, and fandom attention has lately shifted to characters like Zooble and Gangle. But it is important to note that this depiction practically shaped fandom Jax. Though, it is fair to acknowledge the fact that the show is still ongoing, and thus his proper character exploration has yet to fully come to light. But Jax has been one of the biggest points of contention regarding the fandom for The Amazing Digital Circus for a reason. When it comes to female characters, though, the complexity is often already there, it's just not appreciated. Ultimately, I think the nature of woobification in fandom is tied to many people having an unconscious bias towards male characters, which can easily be tied back to society's tendency to excuse the actions of men while infantilizing them. Oh yeah, it goes that deep. And again, I want to make this clear, the people who engage in woobification are not misogynistic. I sincerely doubt these people are earnestly, knowingly infantilizing shitty men. But acknowledging this behavior and the cause of it is a good way to decrease it. I don't think woobification is malicious, far from it, but it often waters down complex and interesting characters while completely ignoring their unique characteristics and arcs. All the characters I analyzed are so much more than innocent beings in need of being coddled. There is so much more to their characters. I will admit, I sometimes slip into the mindset of woobifying a character on accident. I won't act like I'm above this behavior, but hopefully in the future we can have more complicated discussions about our favorite cinnamon rolls.